LSE, and I hope that we'll be doing more events in collaboration with the LSE and Kings as and when we have a chance. Today we have the pleasure of the company of Obaidullah Bahir here, and we are having a sort of roundtable on the West, the Taliban, and the future of Afghanistan. And we have two other panelists who join us via Zoom, Kuramana Kakar and Graham Smith. Just to briefly introduce them, Obaidullah is a visiting fellow at the LSE South Asia Center, and he's an adjunct lecturer at the American University in Kabul. For our panelists, Kuramana Kakar is a peace activist and development practitioner, and currently she's a visiting fellow at the LSE Center for Women, Peace and Security. Graham Smith is a senior consultant at the International Crisis Group in London, focusing on Afghanistan. Just be aware that this event is part of the UK South Asia network, and also know that this event is being recorded. So obviously switch your phones off and things like that, and after the speakers have spoken, we'll open up the floor for discussion and for questions. Best is to keep your questions to the point and brief, so that we know and the speakers are aware exactly how to respond. Thanks very much and welcome again, and let's have a hand here for Obaid.
Thank you everyone for being here. Thank you Subir, Nilanjan, for Graham Smith and Kahramana, who are authorities on Afghanistan, for taking out the time. To all of you for being here. I appreciate that you are interested in knowing about Afghanistan, considering how we live in a very tough market of tragedies where we get very often distracted by newer and newer calamities around the world. The subtitle of this talk had the word morality in it, and that seems such an empty vessel of a word considering the world that we exist in today. But it's good to talk about morality, even if it means very little, even if the policymakers don't care about it. It's sad that I'm giving this talk today, 2 days after the Taliban announced a ban on medical institute training for women, which were the only institutes available to women to study midwifery and nursing, essential services that women in Afghanistan need, a country that has a dire shortage of medical female professionals. We've had deaths of mothers of newborn children throughout the 20 years. It's only going to get worse. I saw someone comment on that situation. Someone on Twitter had put up that the Taliban were inhuman and inhumane. I understand the inhumane part. People can be inhumane. The best of us can have moments where we're inhumane. But inhuman, incapable of being human, it's a very problematic term if you think about it. It's a very colonial term. And I didn't want to come in here and use the C word, but I guess we have to if we're going to talk seriously about how the international community has approached Afghanistan in the past 20 years, and especially in the last 3 years. Bernard Shaw and John Stuart Mill once said that the principles of love thy neighbor and do unto others what you would have done to you both imply a sense of reciprocity, the capacity of your opponent to do back onto you what you deem proper for yourself, right? But the barbarians, the others, the third world, don't really have that capacity. Which is why I contend that the international community approached its engagement with the Taliban with the confirmation bias that the Taliban were incapable of reciprocating. The Taliban, on their part, approached engagement with the international community with a bias that the international community was going to keep moving the goalpost. A few months after the Taliban came to power, I was part of a delegation that sat across the Taliban, sat across the very same people who argued for education for girls in the country, policymakers within the Taliban. And we asked them why these bans were happening. And they said, nothing we do will ever satisfy the West, right? just to confirm to you the confirmation bias that has been operating on both sides. Then the other part of the C word is uplifting. There is always an assumption that the West has a responsibility to bring up the third world to a standard of civilization. And that's maybe fine, right? But the problem is when you assume that those people are incapable of fixing their own affairs, managing them. And that's what has been happening in Afghanistan. This assumption that all is lost, that the Afghans within the country are incapable of changing their fates, and the only way that things can get better is in policy rooms here, through sanctions, through limitations, through the use of force. Now we'll get into the details of those. We're not going to blanket, reject, or accept any of this. And media sensationalism hasn't helped either, right? Because we're lazy. Nuance is inconvenient. It's easy to believe that the voice of women have been banned in Afghanistan, right? Shocking, sensationalist. You hear that and it makes you forget that the Taliban had already banned women from singing, from speaking in public loudly, and the same ban is imposed on men as well, unless you're singing religious songs, which is fine for men. But somehow everyone ends up buying into this without realizing that there are women inside Afghanistan running institutes, they're on the media, and it would take you one single Google search. But the whole goal of organized lying in some ways, which is something the media often does, is it doesn't want you to replace the truth with the lie. It wants you to undermine factuality itself. It wants to tap into your laziness because, hey, you've heard something, it's dark and it's horrible, let's take it for the truth and let's sleep over it, right? Because then we end up doing things that make us feel better, even if it doesn't solve the problem on the ground. Now I just want to be mindful of my time as well. Why is nuance important, right? Nuance is important because when you dig beneath the surface of the news that you hear here, what it does is you realize that there are people on the ground who can make a difference. There are people on the ground who have been detained, who have come out, spoken again, gotten detained again, who are running institutes. It is very inconvenient for you to believe that I am someone who is teaching 70 Afghan women right now as part of their undergraduate program. An institute that is fast running short of funds because the international community has assumed that there are no avenues of resisting the Taliban policies organically. All very extremely problematic outcomes that we need to avoid. Media within the country, voices within the country that need to be heard are often ignored because it's easier to talk to those that are outside. Now, I don't want to put a blanket judgment on those who are outside. A lot of great Afghan activists had to leave the country to save their own lives. I had my own students ask me at one point as to whether they should leave the country. This was right after August 15th. This was when I had decided to stay in the country. And I told them, that is a judgment for you to make. There is no moral requirement for you to put yourself in harm's way. If you think you can do better work or save yourself outside, then go ahead, right? But then that being said, there was a lot that was being done inside the country, and that needed to be acknowledged, needed to be recognized in order for it to grow organically. Why is that important? That is important because when you don't recognize or acknowledge the opportunities that are existent within the country, you lose out on those opportunities. These very medical institutes that I started this conversation about, when the Taliban banned universities for women almost 2 years ago, they banned medical institutes as well. The organizations within Afghanistan pressurized the Ministry of Public Health run by the Taliban to go up to the Taliban leader and convince him that medical institutes were not banned in the first term of the Taliban either. The decision, the exception was made for these medical institutes then. That is why for the past 2 years they were open. But why it didn't matter today when they actually are banned is because you were already convinced that they're banned. You were already convinced that there were no avenues left in Afghanistan left worth fighting for. When they banned women from going to universities, when they banned them from going to work in specific sectors, what we expected from the international community, the outrage we wanted, we didn't see because some had already convinced you that everything was lost already, right? And that makes us lose a lot of momentum. The other way that we very often lose nuance is we forget when we keep seeing Afghanistan with this view of eternal victimhood that they are incapable of coming out of, we turn towards alternatives here that are available to us, exiled politicians who do not have a good reputation, and they end up becoming poster faces for your crusades of salvation, right? You do not ask a question. I don't care if it is a woman's right issue, and it is by all means and definitions an apartheid happening inside Afghanistan today. But I hesitate using that term. I hesitate endorsing international law because it is a Trojan horse. Because when you have my skin tone, international law doesn't really work the way that you would expect it to. Because international law is enforced by someone, for someone, and it is very rarely for us, right? But then what they're doing is, when they are talking about Afghanistan, they are talking to the very same people, the drug lords, the human rights abusers who exploited Afghanistan for 20 years, and somehow they're the ones they turn to. Even if it's a woman, why is it so difficult to ask and actually do a very simple Google search of who this person is I'm talking to? Why? Because it's inconvenient to find a voice inside Afghanistan. I have been invited to talks where I have told them I want someone from within the country to speak. And they say, well, does this person speak English? Well, it'll be too inconvenient to translate them. This is for media outlets, this is for talks that are given internationally. Why? Because we can't be bothered having someone translate it, right? So that's why we've always turned to what is easy for us. But if we are to take the topic of morality of engaging with the Taliban or Afghanistan seriously, we need to understand that the suffering that we want to limit is that of the Afghan people inside the country. They are the main agents in this discussion, and we have to figure out how best to help them instead of doing what makes us feel better and what makes life easier for us. That being said, the shortest path to change is obviously for the policymakers to change their policies. The Taliban are in power. I don't like the Taliban. I've lost friends to the Taliban. I've lost quite a bit of my darker, much better hair to the Taliban coming to power. But that doesn't mean I can put my head in the sand and live in an alternative reality. Because opting out of that reality is an option that you have. It's a luxury that you have, but it's the luxury that 35 million Afghans don't have. But the problem is when we're talking about something like gender apartheid, when we're talking about extreme human rights violations, very often you go from extremes. Either you're not looking for nuance, you're looking for a way that makes you feel better, or you go to the other extreme where you're like, I have to go in and fix this, right? And this whole interventionist mindset is extremely problematic. Now, considering the morality of this topic, it is not, inaction is not an option, right? If the situation is as dire as we understand it to be, then inaction is not the solution, right? A good argument is the international community. There are countries from the EU to the UN who are physically present in Afghanistan, who have kept engaging with the Taliban throughout the past 3 years. They have not produced any results. Then why continue a failed process, right? A good reply to that question is, what is then the alternative? Because what you're seeing, and this is a problem with how we view activism within a country, how we view engagement with a country, we assess success based on large, tangible policy changes. That has not happened in Afghanistan. But then there are things that are changing. There are ways in which Afghans are resisting every day. There are ways in which Afghans are forcing the Taliban to change their ways. There are leaders amongst the Taliban who have come out and publicly spoken against these bans. They would not have done that if it wasn't the constant pressure from the public against these people, forcing them to come up and say something. Now I admit, and this is my major beef with them, is when we sit across them and we tell them, why have you not done anything about this? They tell us, well, we agree with you completely, this is horrible and this should not happen. We have a saying in Pashto. It says, who do you turn to? And excuse my French, it's the judge who has an affair with your wife, right? When the judge is S-ing you over, right? And we turn to these Taliban and we say, we come to you asking you to do something about it, and you're crying over it with us. That's not enough. You need to do something about this. Because we do understand that the shortest path to change is reform amongst the Taliban. If they reverse these decisions tomorrow, it makes everyone's life easier. But that is not the only way available. We should recognize that this is a possible way, that there are possible incentives that could drive some of these policy makers to keep pushing against their supreme leader to get some sort of concessions that makes life livable for Afghans. We're not going to have an ideal world in Afghanistan, not after the Taliban won a total victory after 20 years of fighting. We are going to be playing on their terms. But we need to figure out a way, we need to fight on the margins, and I know this sounds ridiculous from this part of the world, but try being in Afghanistan. Try talking to an Afghan woman who has lost so much, right? For her, having an institute to go to, having a park to be able to visit, having that mental safety, though they do enjoy, and they have said this, the other Afghan woman and man are ignored in this conversation, because for the past 20 years of American presence in Afghanistan, there was a specific elite that were catered to. There was no natural trickle down of the perks of US liberty that was brought to Afghanistan, liberty that was brought to us after dropping bombs on these other Afghan men and women and ruining their lives, right? There was a cost to the development you saw within the cities, a development that never happened in those regional areas. The regional areas only saw night raids, they saw destruction, both at the hands of the Taliban and the international community, the military forces that were available there. Today, those deaths don't happen. That is one reason why the rural parts of Afghanistan, who've had a huge stake in revolutions in the country in the past, are not willing to come out and protest and overthrow the Taliban. They are the people that need to be won over. But that's a conversation for us Afghans to have, a conversation that we are having. But there are right ways to do it. while you talk to the Taliban, the naysayers, the ones, moderate is a very strong word, so I'm not going to use it for them, but those who believe that women are human beings too are worth talking to, because they break the echo chamber within the Taliban. But also the larger Afghan population is worth talking to. Those who are imposing themselves on the current situation are worth recognizing. And why are they worth recognizing? I know I will return to the idea of the very cutthroat market of tragedies, where Ukraine stole our thunder after it happened, because people were talking about Afghanistan, then they were talking about Ukraine, and now they're talking about Palestine, and every day there is a bigger and bigger tragedy that distracts the world, and we have forgotten about Afghanistan. In such a situation, it is extremely important to A, trouble yourself with nuance. Let's ask ourselves, what is truly happening on the ground there? Push the Taliban to change their ways, but then talk to the people within the country, platform them, connect with them, acknowledge them. If you here refuse to acknowledge that there are women journalists within Afghanistan that are still coming on TV every day, that have tried to resist Taliban policies, either on the face covering or on being live there, they're figuring out newer and newer ways to trick the Taliban into letting them be on air. When they banned them from having other men in the studio with them, they ended up having people, I probably shouldn't say this because what if they're watching? They figured out ways to get around the bans, right? But ultimately, I want us to realize that you break it, you own it. The international community cannot blame the situation in Afghanistan on Afghans alone. The international community and the United States and its allies are directly responsible for what has been happening in Afghanistan for the past 40 years. The Cold War gave rise to communist ranks within the country. In reaction, the Islamist groups rise up. The Soviet invasion as a result of the Cold War happens. US funding happens. The Mujahideen break into factions. As a reaction, the Taliban emerge. The Taliban come to power. War on terror brings the United States into the country, and 20 years later, you bring the Taliban back with a vengeance. You, who are a major player on the situation in Afghanistan, so you can't turn around and not claim any responsibility for what has happened. Which is why it is fundamentally important to recognize that responsibility, to get out of the mindset of the browner people not being capable of saving themselves, of approaching engagement with the Taliban with the mindset of its failure already as a confirmation bias, but keep doing what we are doing. We can go both ways. These are both mutually exclusive. You can keep talking to the Taliban while you keep investing in organic movements within the country. But what you should not do is use international law to sanction the population that is already suffering under an economy that the Taliban didn't bring. This economy was on the verge of collapse, being kept on life support through funding by the United States that was cut off within a day. They didn't build an economy for us that was sustainable. It was on life support with international money, and the day that money stopped, our economy went crashing down. So the fact that millions have not died out of hunger is due to Afghans fighting back. There were so many Afghans who carried flour bags on their backs, went to villages and helped their fellow countrymen. We have that capacity to do that. But unfortunately, whether you look at the longer history of Afghanistan or the shorter history, international empire and politics have broken us apart. They have made us talk about ethnicities and factions and hatred towards each other, being so subsumed by international politics that we haven't found enough time to come together as a nation. It's a project that every Afghan should work on, that is trying to work on today despite the circumstances. I will leave you with this. The worst crime that one can commit, either suffering an atrocity or being outside it, is to give into despair, to give into inaction. But that does not mean interventionism, that does not mean sanctions, and that does not mean codifying international law that ultimately paves the way for military intervention, such that has happened in Libya, in different contexts around the world, where ultimately hegemonic Western interests come to you in the guise of humanitarian intervention. We don't want that. We tried that for 20 years. It's time for us to change things. You can help, your policymakers can help, but it starts with not seeing Afghanistan in black and white and actually looking at the nuance beyond the fake news, beyond the sensationalism, and talking to the people on the ground, supporting them whichever way you can. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much, Obed. That's a fantastic opening remark that you've given there. Questions of morality, humanity, the politics of the confirmation bias, responsibility. I hope we will come back to some of this. I'd like to now invite Kuramana Thakur, who is joining us via Zoom. Welcome, and around the 8-minute mark, I guess I'll give you some indication to invite. Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you so much. Thanks to the organizers for the opportunity to share my thoughts on this very important topic, a topic that everybody is grappling with, and it has been overly complicated simply because Afghans are not listened to, or the majority is not listened to, the majority that is living inside the country. Ubaidullah has set the scene really nicely, and I completely agree with the fact that the rhetoric of centering Afghans living the everyday reality inside the country is critical to the solution. So, over 3 years into the Taliban rule, Afghanistan remains caught in a precarious balance between authoritarian regime and the international abandonment. The West, uncertain of how to engage with the Taliban, has largely withdrawn its attention. Meanwhile, the Taliban continue to enforce regressive policies, particularly targeting women and girls and alternative voices, while showing no signs of giving up on these repressive or oppressive policies, and no sign and interest in any sort of political inclusion or political solution. The prevailing sense of despair in international discussions about Afghanistan is counterproductive. The question we must confront is not whether engaging with the Taliban is morally justifiable, but how engagement can be structured to alleviate human suffering, foster incremental reforms, and support the emergence of alternative voices and structures within Afghan society. A careful, collaborated approach to engagement centering the interests of Afghan people offers the only viable pathway in a more stable and hopeful future for the Afghan people who are living inside the country. The current Western approach of isolating Afghanistan has done little to encourage reform and has instead exacerbated the human suffering and humanitarian crisis in the country. According to the United Nations, around 90% of Afghans now live below the poverty line, with women and children disproportionately affected by deprivation. This economic collapse undermines any potential for grassroots change by leaving civil society and independent voices vacant or non-existent. Isolation has also diminished the international community's ability to monitor Taliban's action on the ground and to influence their policy. So instead of punishing the rulers, isolation has been primarily punishing Afghan people. So the case for engagement with the Taliban is not about endorsing their rule, but about acknowledging the realities on the ground. The Taliban are the de facto rulers of Afghanistan, and sustainable change cannot be achieved without addressing this reality. International engagement must aim to mitigate the worst effects of their governance while laying the groundwork for longer-term transformation within Afghan society, socially and politically. Engagement should be framed around three core objectives: alleviating human suffering. Immediate humanitarian aid must be decoupled from political considerations to ensure that the basic needs of Afghans are met, supporting local organizations and ensuring aid delivery through neutral channels can prevent misuse while addressing urgent crises. Promoting incremental reforms, diplomatic engagement and provision of space to the regime can be tied to specific measurable changes in the Taliban behavior and policies. For instance, allowing girls to return to school, enabling women to work in public roles, or fostering independent media could serve as a starting point. While modest, these reforms could pave the way for broader societal shifts over time. Supporting alternative voices is my last recommendation. Engagement should prioritize fostering spaces for independent voices within Afghanistan, within the country. Civil society organizations, women groups, and youth networks must be empowered to contribute to a more inclusive future. By creating opportunities for dialogue and participation, these groups can challenge the authoritarian regimes and build a foundation for long-term change. The importance of Afghan-led solution is key. While international engagement is crucial, lasting change in Afghanistan can only come from within, and I think Ubaidullah has stressed on this point enough. A political settlement and a new national compact rooted in the Afghan voices and aspiration is essential for moving beyond conflict and divisions. This requires Afghans to confront their differences and commit to a shared vision for the future. A reconciliation, although it's a very challenging term at the moment, but the only way for mutual healing and moving forward together. An inclusive dialogue involving the Afghan people is key in this whole discourse. So the role of international community is crucial. I mean, despite the fact that the international community's engagement has not been very helpful with the Taliban or disengagement, but they do have a role to play. And they do have moral responsibility to support Afghan-led efforts towards reconciliation and reform. And this can be achieved by facilitating dialogues for the international and regional community as well, to act as mediators or facilitators and supporters of spaces bringing Afghan stakeholders together for negotiations. Conditional support, negotiating the possibility of development aid and resources tied to specific verifiable changes in governance and human rights. Maintaining presence, ensuring that international organizations and NGOs continue to operate within Afghanistan, delivering services and monitoring conditions, as well as supporting local organizations and grassroots civil society movements, particularly women. So the international community, including the regional community, must also adopt a long-term perspective, recognizing that progress in deeply authoritarian system is incremental and requires patience and sustained commitment. I would stop my remarks here, but look forward to further discussion. Thank you.
Thank you there, Kuramana, for also your impeccable timing. Can I now invite Greg to come in and also speak for around 8 minutes, and around that mark I'll make myself visible. Greg, thanks very much.
Thanks for the kind invitation. My name is Graham Smith. I think I was erroneously introduced as an expert on Afghanistan. I have been working on Afghanistan issues for about 2 decades for the most part, but really, like a lot of other stupid white guys who have been in and out of the country, I'm more of an expert on the collision between Afghanistan and international policymakers. And so, I work now for the International Crisis Group, and I'm part of the mess that Obaid so aptly described, I think. These rooms of foreigners trying to come up with an idea of what is happening in the country and formulating ideas about what should be done about it. And back when I was working for the UN or when I was part of the Afghan peace process, we were wrangling with some pretty big issues. In previous years, the war in Afghanistan was the deadliest conflict on the planet Earth at times. So, there were at various points in various years in its recent history, there were more people being killed in battle annually in Afghanistan than there were in Syria or in Yemen or in Iraq. The war kept escalating and escalating. And so, there were moments where the decisions by, frankly, mostly stupid white guys like me, those decisions were very consequential for the future of the country. It was an American diplomat who stood between Ghani and Abdullah and, declared the National Unity Government to be a thing not too long ago. It was another American diplomat in Doha who, signed the Doha Agreement with the Taliban. These were big consequential moments in the recent history of Afghanistan. And I have to say, nowadays, for better and for worse, the role of us foreigners is much smaller and more humble. In the immediate aftermath of the withdrawal of US forces, a lot of the focus was just on humanitarian access, making sure that aid could arrive unimpeded at Kabul airport. Some of the engagement has expanded over time. There's now a fairly functional but pretty quiet collaboration ongoing with the Taliban on counterterrorism issues. There have been a number of talks that Obaid alluded to on the economic future of the country, for example, that remain ongoing. We just, in recent weeks, got a finalized set of terms of agreement for something called the Doha 3 follow-up track. As far as I know, that meeting hasn't happened yet, but at some point, representatives of a large number of regional and international countries will sit down in a room with representatives of the Taliban to try to continue the conversation about what Obaid so eloquently described as, the sort of ongoing economic pressure, the sanctions, the asset freezes, the various ways in which the isolation of the Taliban regime continues to impede the economic recovery, continues to drive one of the largest poverty and humanitarian crises in the world, and how Afghanistan can be allowed to rebuild after the war. But those talks, frankly, are going to be very slow because the elephant in the room, as you just heard from the previous speaker, is the politics. And those politics remain terribly stuck. Again, as you heard, with the decision on the education of women in medical institutions just in the last week, that is really going to make it even harder. It's the latest in a series of Taliban edicts restricting the rights of Afghan women and girls. that really, drive the regime further and further away from any kind of recognition on the international stage. And that's, there's no international handbook of recognition. I've looked back at dozens of case studies of what happens when, rebels come over the walls and insurgents take over a government in the post-World War II history. And there's no manual for how to do it, for how to gain recognition. But there is a 9-member credentials committee in New York. And just the political reality, I think, is that it will be politically very difficult for the Taliban to get a vote in their favor and sit and represent Afghanistan in the UN General Assembly, as long as they continue to completely reject the opening words of the UN Charter, because some of the very first words in the United Nations Charter enshrine the idea of equality between men and women. And the Taliban have lots of interesting ideas about how to run a country, and some of those ideas are working out quite well. Some of their track record so far in anti-corruption has proven to be better than the last government. They are opening up the roads and improving the flow of trade and collecting taxes, and they're doing a bunch of things quite efficiently. But they definitely do not believe that men and women have exactly equal rights. And so it is going to be, I think, difficult for us to unstick the political issues. And so that is going to be a very long process. I expect that Afghanistan will remain on the outside of the international system for a very long time. And so then the question becomes, what do you do with a country that is a so-called pariah state? And who gets to decide what's a pariah state and what's not? And that comes back to Obaid's thoughts about colonialism and who makes these decisions. I think in practical terms, in the short term, the solution is not going to be further action against Afghanistan at the ICC or the ICJ, even though you can expect both of those institutions to move forward with trying to prosecute the Taliban for being bad. I just don't think that is going to produce better outcomes for the girls and women on the ground. I think what will produce better outcomes for the girls and women on the ground is to keep the lights on, quite literally. So, infrastructure projects, electricity. When Obaid is contacting his students in Kabul, he does so, I believe, over the internet. How do you get spare parts for cell phone towers these days into Afghanistan? You have to make sure there's some basic functionality between a pariah state and the outside world, so that there can be this bit of openness, even though there's a government that not everybody approves of. Sorry, I've been rambling on, and I see that you're ready to start the more interactive session, and I look forward to it. I look forward to the questions.
Thanks very much, Graham. Can I now invite Obaid to maybe briefly comment on and perhaps respond to some of the remarks made by Kuramana and by Graham? Let's do that for 5 minutes. My loud alarm will sound at that point.
Okay, perfect.
And then we will open up for Q&A discussion.
Okay, I actually don't have a lot to comment on what has been said. Part of me had preempted that the more practical discussions will come out with Kahramana and Graham. In no way is Graham not an expert on Afghanistan. You need to pick up his book to see how deeply invested he has been in the country. Kahramana has been doing great work in engaging with the Taliban and pushing against policies. There are some more practical examples of what has been happening on the ground that can be supported. A few of us ran a campaign under the banner Let Afghan Girls Learn, This was right before the university ban on women was enforced. We had received a tip, ironically from within the Taliban, saying that a ban on universities was coming. They wanted people to raise the alarm and push back so that they could use it as a counter argument to the central authority that was making this decision. We spent weeks organizing events, having talks on the need for girls' education, the practicality of it, how we could fund it, how we could address the Islamic education as well, incorporate it within the schooling system. And ultimately, one good way the international community was trying to help was they reached out to us and they said, hey, you're doing a great job. If you want us to help you with your campaign, we're willing to endorse that. I mean, obviously it wasn't going to be the smartest choice for us, because the last thing I wanted was to be captured by the Taliban and have American dollars in my pocket. But it was a good way of thinking. It was identifying, don't endorse campaigns, social campaigns like what we were doing, but look at institutions. Google Dr. Shifa Ju's hospital in Afghanistan today, where she is teaching Afghan women the same medical institutes we talked about, the ban was recently enforced upon. She is one person who still hasn't received that notice. She, for the past 2 days, has been still teaching women. Why didn't you identify her before? Why didn't policymakers talk to her? Why wasn't an investment made? You know, you think that engagement was done, Taliban didn't reciprocate, well, let's move on. Engagement was never done on important issues. Try sitting with any international policymaker in the past 3 years. The word development was frowned upon because, hey, we're not going to do any development in Afghanistan while the Taliban are like this. This was the attitude from day one till today. And now there is a very good excuse for international donors to say, we're not going to spend any more money in Afghanistan. Aid has been drying up. Development aid has never been talked about. They were just throwing money at a fire and it's just burning and it's not getting us anywhere. They're constantly trying to feed us fish, whereas we want to learn how to do fishing, right? And that can happen when internal infrastructures grow, right? If you look at Eastern Europe, and I'll leave you with this thought, you look at Eastern Europe, you look at the color revolutions within there were 3 types of movements there, not mutually exclusive all the time. There were revisionists who believed that the system could reform and that they could produce better results. They were waiting for a Dubček like in Czechoslovakia to emerge to reform the party, and ultimately that failed. There were the second group that were trying to build an opposition to the government, to push back politically, have negotiations and concessions. But ultimately what ended up changing the futures of these countries was the neo-evolutionist organic grassroots movements. Unless you have enough people coming out and standing by and for something, real changes do not happen. Real changes do not happen in international meeting rooms that are right now meeting people that are selecting who represent Afghans, right? And my chapter on intra-Afghan dialogue is coming out on 10th December as part of a book in which we discuss in detail what this crisis of representation is. You did not have a true democracy in Afghanistan for 20 years. So the people that you think represented Afghanistan and you talk to today here within your meeting rooms do not represent Afghans, which is why the best way to go around this is to look at who is imposing themselves on this conversation today. People who don't have blood on their hands, who don't have corruption charges on them, they're the people worth talking to, like Kahramana and Graham Smith told you, because the lifelines of the society cannot be sustained. Organic change cannot happen when people are dying from hunger. Empty bellies do not think of revolutions, right? So we have to remember that if that is our guide, solutions will appear, and solutions have to appear from inside Afghanistan.
Thank you very much. Well, there's a lot that's been put out on the table. Humanity, morality, confirmation bias, equality, apartheid, responsibility, engagement, development, abandonment, hope, stupid white guys, and state capacity issues. And who knows? I think of all of these categories, maybe the stupid white guys have the most power. So but let's take questions from the audience, 3 at a time. Please keep your questions short, and if you do have follow-up questions, hang on till some other people have also had a chance to ask questions. So yes, let's go for it. Let's put you in the frame of our camera.
Okay.
I'll be in the background. Yes, there's one from Gotham here. Excuse me, I only know the name of some people because they're my students. Yes, and one over there and one over here. I'll come back to you this time.
Fantastic talk. Firstly, thank you for that. So you've touched upon the need to continue engagement with the Taliban and Afghanistan. My question would be, do you also think that with the treatment by the international community of Afghanistan as sort of a pariah state, you're actually strengthening the worst elements within the Taliban? So is that also sort of a trend that you notice?
Yes, please.
As a non-Afghan, or as an Afghan who has never been to Afghanistan, and feels a deep sense of sadness and helplessness at the plight of the Afghans, what is some practical guidance for educating ourselves and helping these grassroots organic movements on the ground?
And one.
A lot of talks about engagement with Taliban. My question is, do we understand Taliban's mindset behind the policies that it takes, and why it comes on different times, like such bans, like why they didn't happen just once and for all? Why every now and then there is a new decision? How they think about what is the rationale behind these decisions, and are they, from their part, interested in interacting with the international community? Second one, quickly, the recent expansion in the Taliban's diplomatic presence in the world. We have seen connections with China, with India, lately with some UAE countries, some Gulf countries, UAE, Qatar. So how this expansion with the international community might or might not help the engagement with this country.
Did Graham and Kurumana also hear the questions clearly enough? Yes? Okay, so...
I'll give a very short answer with Kahramana and Graham's permission, and please do add to if that's okay. Can you guys hear me? Okay. Just quickly, I'll go on the engagement and then we'll talk about we don't have an exit clause on being Afghan. It doesn't matter if you've spent your whole life outside. If you are an Afghan, you're Afghan till you die. So we're not going to disown you. So basically on engagement, one of the larger problems as well is first on confirming the biases of the international community. Look, if I told you that 2.5 years ago or 3 years ago, the Taliban already were saying that this is a moving goalpost, you know, they will never be satisfied. It wasn't them saying it, it was the policy maker that was telling them that I don't want to make concessions because there's no way of winning them over. And ultimately, the more Afghanistan becomes a pariah state, the easier it is for them to do whatever they want, right? I've sat across Taliban ministers and I've told them, my concern is that you are constantly addressing your worst, lowest common denominator, which is your own ranks, the most rigid and radical people. Your policies are constantly tailored to them. And they say, no, they've arrived at a point where their own Taliban are being frustrated. There is an angle there of ISIS and the fear of them being a catching net for defectors from the Taliban. So the Taliban very often are worried that people are going to escape and turn to more radical entities. On engagement and why do we understand their mindset? They have books out in which they explain their models. Pick up the book of Abdul Hakim Haqqani, who's their Chief Justice, who wrote in detail of exactly what they were going to do. So it has been coming from that. Why do they do it in different times? Maybe it's a rational approach of saying if we banned everything in one day, maybe people will come out. We don't really understand exactly what the mindset behind that is. But ultimately, yes, the regional powers, they're already engaging with the Taliban. The Taliban already have recognized ambassadors being received by these neighboring countries. So a lot of times you imagine that, well, if you turn it into a pariah state, the Taliban are doomed. No, they have lifelines. There are countries that want to oppose the current Western powers, right? They want to break that axis and balance it out. On what to do, it's quite tricky, you know, but it takes a lot of effort. It means going out there, it means reading on what is happening, but ultimately reaching out to organizations on the ground. And it can be tricky because the information limited to you means that you might end up endorsing an organization that really isn't doing a great job or is a scam on the front of it. But good research, reaching out to people on the ground, talking to people on the ground. There are really good thinkers out there who do constantly put content out about Afghanistan. Watch that, follow that. It's a little bit extra effort, but once you put that in, you can really actually break through. And rather than thinking, look, your taxes are going into UN money that is going into Afghanistan that has 60% overhead. Right? So every dollar you're giving, it's only 40 cents of it are reaching Afghans because they have to do vacations because God, they're in Afghanistan every 20 days. They have to go to some European country and enjoy themselves, or they have to have these lush compounds and all of that. But if you recognize local organizations, every penny you're sending in is actually reaching Afghans, right? So think beyond aid. Think about people doing projects to help empower Afghans and Afghan women. Think about institutes that are training women on technical skills. Think about institutes that are medically training women. There are institutes there. There are no hidden schools in Afghanistan. People are running schools within their houses with local Taliban aware of that. Find out those schools. Fund them, get them books. Even $100 can get a library made for a school in Afghanistan. That might not change the whole outcome, but at least you would have done something beyond just saying, well, this is too bad for them, let's go back to Spain, right?
Thank you, Obed. I think Kuramana has to leave soon. So let us have her come in. And are there any specific questions for her? Because she will be gone, I think, in the next 5 or 10 minutes.
Or if she wants to comment on what was.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. So let us go to her for her comments. And if there are any questions that you have specific to her, please ask them before she leaves.
Yeah, thank you. I'll just be brief in my comments. I think Obed has already spoken what I wanted to say. But in terms of the engagement, I think we need to be clear what we mean by engagement. And every time I talk about engagement with the Taliban, I personally also receive a lot of pushback on why do you promote engagement with the Taliban while there shouldn't be engagement because of their repressive policies. But what is a way out? And when we talk about engagement, we need to think about the different levels of engagement, the phases, the conditions. From a peace building perspective, it's not engaging with the Taliban to address their concerns or to meet their conditions and to recognize them. It's about engaging with them as the only means that we have right now in order to alleviate the suffering of the common, ordinary Afghans on the ground. So it's a very technical aspect, a very technical term, but there is a lot of nuance to it, and it needs in-depth understanding within Afghans, first of all. On practical examples to support grassroots movements, and particularly women and girls in the education, doing anything and everything to support communities on the ground, particularly women and girls, is something that we encourage all the time. I work with women in some of the really very strict regions in the country where the Taliban, even before the Taliban came to power, they were powerful. And we provide women and girls trainings in mediation and conflict resolution and trauma response. Because of what is happening right now, a lot of women and girls have been through a huge amount of trauma. And these women then go in the communities and they talk to women and other girls and try to help them. So these are small ways, but this is actually one way to bring them together into a dialogue, to bring them together, to give them a space, a safe space where they can talk to each other. So agency building or enhancing agency among civil society groups, women and girls on the ground, is the core to achieving anything else in the present circumstances. And the Taliban's engagement with the international community, as Ubaidullah mentioned, I mean, they are going out. I mean, when you talk to countries in the region, I mean, they have really good relationships with the Taliban. They have businesses, they have trade happening with Afghanistan, and there are contracts, big contracts happening in Afghanistan, and many businesses are benefiting from this trade in the region. But when we talk to them about their influence and leverage to speak to the Taliban, to act as mediators, they just sit back and they are like, this is not our problem. So we need to make these countries accountable as well, whoever is engaging with the Taliban. And also when we talk about isolation or engaging with the Taliban, this might be the best strategy that the Taliban are currently benefiting from. We don't know what the non-recognition, the isolation, and the abandonment is doing to the country, and the Taliban's objectives are being advanced because there is no international presence on the ground, I mean, as it should be in terms of accountability and mutual responsibility internationally and regionally. So thinking about all of these political aspects when we talk about whether we should engage with the Taliban or not, or whether we should provide support to people on the ground. Humanitarian aid, for instance, should never be politicized, should never be promoted as a condition for the Taliban to serve or to change their attitudes and behavior. There can be ways to make them accountable and bringing neutral voices and neutral institutions in place, supporting them to deliver those aid, but not necessarily saying that humanitarian. This is one thing that I hear a lot as well in a lot of spaces. So I would actually go against this argument, only because we don't want Afghan people to suffer anymore. I'm sorry, I need to go to another event, so I'll leave you all here, and all the best, and wish you all a very good discussion going forward. But look forward to these continuous discussions in the future as well. Thank you so much.
for joining us. Okay, Graham, would you like to come in and respond before we open up to the next round of questions?
Well, these are hard acts to follow, so I won't say too much, but the short answer to the question about whether we understand what's going on inside the Taliban is no, we do not understand. We know, for example, that there was a meeting of the cabinet today in Kandahar to discuss the latest edict from the emir that he didn't want women to be receiving medical education. We know that that must have been controversial, especially amongst any Taliban who do not want their wives and daughters to die in childbirth. I mean, it's just a basic, like two-thirds of all births in the country are currently attended by some sort of medical professional. That's not a particularly high standard. Sometimes, you see like 6 women giving birth together in the same room with one overworked nurse kind of going back and forth between them. But at any rate, so far, the maternal mortality numbers do not look worse under the Taliban than they did under the previous government. But I can tell you, if they go ahead with this stupid rule, it's going to look a lot worse. And so I hope that they're having serious conversations down there in Kandahar today about that. But we don't know the content of those discussions. So it is a black box. But to your question about whether or not pressure from the outside makes things worse. Having been talking to the Taliban in various jobs of mine since 2006, 2007, quite a while now, my limited understanding of them is they're pretty stubborn people, and they tend to push back when you push them. And so they might have to arrive at some of these decisions themselves rather than us pushing them, because I think pressure from the outside tends to make them dig in their heels. Back to you.
Yeah, there's one question there, and there's one here, and there's one there.
thank you for your lecture. And
Speak up a little bit if you can.
Yes. I have a plan to do a PhD with my topic on the origins of Taliban and its interaction with the local tribes. And I think that for now there's the few books or monographs on the role of Taliban too. And I think it's the best way to explore this topic is to go to field research in Afghanistan. But how to? One of my friends said that when it comes to economy, you can do business with Taliban. But if you want to ask him about politics, they will you are not be welcome. So how can I do such a field research in Afghanistan now?
Thank you, and let's take one here and then one in the back.
Yeah, I've been following the Taliban, and everybody does generally, and the treatment of women. You know, before 9/11, it was pretty bad. Now it's still pretty bad. I'm just wondering. I'm thinking, are we looking at this in a wrong, analytical, Western way? They're Islamists. You know, they're quite stubborn on their reading of Islam. Do we maybe need to approach them not from a Western angle, but from a global Islamic angle, in the sense that do we need global Islamic reformist movements to engage with them, speak to them at their own language, at their own level, and see if there's any scope for them to, you know, maybe lessen the impact of some of their repressive policies? Are we maybe looking at it in a wrong way or not, is my question.
Okay, and yes,
thank you so much. Just I have two short comments and also one question. First of all, I want to talk about a comment which is made by Ismail about the Taliban's anti-corruption policies. And you said that they are quite successful compared to the previous government. And I think it's not right to say like that, because as far as I know, and the same nepotism which was prevalent in previous government is going in much larger scale under the Taliban administration right now in Afghanistan. And I don't know, and I didn't understand how you said that. And also the second comment is about I don't agree about that they're using Ubaidullah about Afghan. You talked and you blamed the colonialism and the Western hegemony. I do agree we should do that, but at the same time we should be brave and we should be critical to also criticize the word even Afghan, which is, you know, that is problematic and itself it is a construct of colonialism, which goes back to the establishment of nation state in the late 19th century in Afghanistan, because practically the term Afghan does not apply to all ethnicities inside Afghanistan. It basically refers to Pashtuns, not to all ethnicities. For instance, I'm a Hazara. I don't want to be called Afghan, and I request from Ubaidullah that we should be brave when we talk about the issue of Afghanistan as younger generation of Afghanistan, that we should recognize these things. And also, I think it's not fair that we always should blame the colonialism, the Western hegemony. Also, there is hegemony it has, you know, several layers, and one layer is inside Afghanistan. Those who are representing, you know, the colonial interests since late 19th centuries, and basically with respect to Ubaidullah, you know, they were the Pashtuns. They were the Pashtuns who were the dominant group since the late 19th century, when the British Empire established the nation state, and it became the Pashtun state. And says now they were, you know, the dominant group. And I think when we talk about these, it's better that we should criticize, you know, this problematic, and we should understand these nuances. For instance, also
please,
very short.
Let us get to a question.
I need the question, please.
Please come.
Yeah, my question is now. My question is also referred to about the engagement with the Taliban. I don't know how moral it is that we should talk about engagement with the Taliban. You name, you know, the Haqqani book. The very ideology of the Taliban is against human dignity. with the suppression, the persecution of the minority groups, the ethnicities, the
Can I
women,
request you
which
to
is
have the
going
panel
on.
respond to you?
How moral it
Yeah,
is,
that's fine, that's
how
fine.
moral it is that we should
Let them
talk
respond.
about
Please.
something which is immoral.
That's great. So
Okay.
let us go and have
Great.
a response to Khalid.
So obviously the start of this conversation was not that we believe the Taliban to be a very morally upright group, because if they were morally upright, we wouldn't be having this discussion for the past 1.5 hours. One thing that is worth remembering is when all are blamed, none is blamed, right? This is a very important thing to remember. When you say that there is a hegemonic group and that group is a whole ethnicity that has been dominating and oppressing, you disperse the blame. When you look at the Taliban and associate their political actions with the whole ethnicity that they happen to be a part of but do not represent, because no one represents a whole ethnicity, that is a problematic argument within Afghanistan as well. We have Dawood Azami here. Please do have a conversation with him about the origin of the term Afghan. You can choose to disagree with it, but that is your personal prerogative. Afghans is a geographic identifier for people within a specific geography within that region that turned into a national identifier. There are historians who would tell you that the term Afghan was associated with Pashtuns alone, yet there are historians that would tell you otherwise, that it was associated with the people that lived within this land. Yes, there is a complication when we think about nation states and change the dynamics of that debate, but that is a separate discussion that is beyond engagement with the Taliban, right? Engagement on their terms, I think that that's a very important topic to think about, because very often we universalize rationality. We believe that there is one specific way in which everyone assesses cost and benefit, right? But that's not how the world works. We have really good literature on China's foreign policy as well that shows you that it is driven by a different rationale, right? I personally have written work on how the Taliban operate on an honor-driven rationale. Honor-driven, China is face-driven, right? Which means you have to respect me in order for us to get anywhere. No amount of benefit will matter to me if you're not respecting me. An honor-driven culture actually looks at, I don't care just about respecting me, I care about the optics of it. Which is why very often we see the Taliban acting in very specific ways when it's about their public appearance or not. So it is important, especially for Islamic countries and Islamic scholars, to come and engage with them, but it's also important for us to understand the rationality of the Taliban as well and how they operate. And just a short comment on the last, how do we do research? I don't think you will have a major barrier because some literature is existent. Ashley Jackson is a good way of looking at, who talked about how the Taliban engaged with local communities. But you can also visit Afghanistan. You don't necessarily need to declare. Just don't be very fishy. Make sure that the Taliban are aware that you are there. You do your research through research institutions there. Talk to Kabul University. Associate yourself with the lecturer there. These are important research topics. I am working on Islamic governance myself, so I encourage more and more research into that symptom. Yeah.
I have a further question. Like, if I
We can talk
We'll go
after
like
this though. Please
Sorry.
catch me after this and I'll hopefully help you.
We'll get back to you, but let's also have Graham respond. And as I said, if you have a follow-up question, you can come back later. But meanwhile, we can have more people ask their first questions. Please go ahead, Graham, if you would like to respond.
So on the question about how you do field work, I would say extremely carefully. I think there are a number of foreigners who are still in Taliban detention. So yeah, I mean, it's not the safest place to work, although I think it is a lot safer now than it was under the previous government. Just there are a lot fewer things going bang. On that question about nepotism, this is an interesting one actually, because nepotism and anti-corruption are not, it's not a clear sort of one-to-one relationship. For example, the Taliban went and replaced the folks who work in the customs houses with loyalists, many of them from Kandahar, and you might call that an example of nepotism because there it's, it wasn't an open competitive process. They appointed people they trust, people who were close to them. But the upshot of that was that when Dr. David Mansfield did satellite-based assessments of how many trucks are rolling through the customs and then correlated that with how much money was being paid into the treasury, he assessed that on an annual basis, the Taliban had eliminated $1.4 billion a year worth of corruption from that customs system. So, yeah, I mean, nepotism, corruption, it can be a little bit of a murky thing, although I do take your point that that these days a lot of appointments are people who are close to, you know, the Kandaharis. So that's clear that that's, you know, not a problem that has been solved. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Okay, let's take the next 3 questions. Yes, please.
Okay, thank you very much. I've worked in Afghanistan for the last 2 decades, so I'm quite very familiar with it. I've always found the West intervention for the last 20 years very problematic. In particular, the way, I think, the main narrative, which has always been, you know, we want to speak to people who speak English, women being either the heroines, because the West needs an Afghan heroine, or they're victims, right? So, you know, it's this kind of thing. I don't think that's changed, you know, because I've been collecting all of these articles or whatever, you know, whatever, even after the Taliban took over. My question to you is that the women who left, like the MPs, Fazia Coffins, all of them here, they have the ear of the Western policymakers and the international. And I remember right at the beginning, Fazia Coffee being in tears, right? Sort of saying, well, we're just refugees here now. But at the end of the day, they were actually dominating the agenda of what should happen for women in Afghanistan. They still are, I think. And they're in a very good position to do that, or not, because, you know, there are different views. And they have always maintained that position. We don't want to negotiate with the Taliban. You know, non-recognition of the Taliban. So you have the Afghan women and men who are saying we do need to negotiate with the Taliban because they're not a monolithic group. You have got moderates and you've got the Kandahari group. And I kind of feel, because my sympathies and my kind of heart goes out to the ordinary women and men who are really poor in this sort of thing. And then you kind of got this group who are the diaspora, the refugees, who've always been very privileged, even when they were in Afghanistan. Quite nepotistic, looked after their own benefits quite a lot of the time. The ordinary people didn't trust the politicians, right, to actually bring about change in their country. So how do you see this in terms of the agenda being put? You know, whether we like it or not, the West has this, you know, way of kind of saying, these are the issues and this is what we're going to do. And then you kind of got the Afghans, you know, the Taliban, we don't worry. But, you know, then we kind of ignore because we don't know what to do.
Thank you. Any further questions in this
That's
round?
a lot of questions, sorry.
Yes, please.
Just to build off of that, what are your thoughts on the role of men in the Afghan diaspora in the post-2021 period, specifically? And specifically about pledging support to the Taliban or the opposite?
Okay, and I thank you. And if I could just take a couple of points from your observation and yours. There was a quite comprehensive question regarding whether, you know, international sort of community should also specifically have a range of voices and representatives from Islamic countries, and therefore the way in which it is set up as a West versus Taliban could somehow be replaced or made more compound by that kind of addition. And the question that sort of came from there, which if I can rephrase but with your permission, which is if it is the case that there is, and I don't know how pervasive is the feeling that you mentioned, but if it is the case that non-Pashtuns do not feel as much a part of Afghanistan as perhaps Pashtuns do, though I remember that you actually sort of commented on that question, how does that sort of result in crises of governance or crises of state capacity? When we, for example, look at nepotism and the Kandahar people, it seems that there is some impact of that kind of a feeling of not being the same in terms of political weightage as Pashtuns. So how does that sort of compound the problems that we are talking about? Or conversely, is it a way to think that Islamism is in fact some kind of a way to deal with the heterogeneity that exists in terms of ethnic heterogeneity?
Great. So, I mean, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results, right? And I've said this to policymakers around the world. I have looked them in the eye and I've told them the people they are talking to are the same people that brought us here. I have had policymakers from the Republic who used to abuse their power day in, day out, who were knee-deep in corruption. Our cabinets were a fiesta for our parliamentarians, because when the cabinet votes were in, everyone would set their rate, everyone had $10,000 to $20,000 for their votes, and a million other ways in which they were involved in humanitarian abuses, drug trade, you name it, right? And these very same people end up they abuse this fact that Afghanistan has a crisis of representation, saying, well, we were the parliamentarians, despite having enjoyed all that privilege and abused it in the past. I feel like it's not like we should dismiss everyone. There are people within the Republic who are doing a decent job, but they need to start their conversation with saying, here is my role in how we got here, and here is how I propose to help, right? It cannot start from a point of amnesia where you've suddenly popped into the scene and now have wonderful solutions to provide us, right? One. Number two, yes, there is this tension because the international community says, who do I talk to? These people are more convenient, they have better ties, they speak the language, they understand the politics, let's keep talking to them. But the problem is that there are people on the ground there who have suffered at their hands, right? And ultimately, it's not that difficult for them to find alternative voices. And it shouldn't be about choosing or selecting. It should be about looking at who is imposing themselves on the conversation. Kahramana is sitting and talking to the Taliban and imposing herself on the conversation, right? So she makes for a decent candidate to sit down to and talk to, rather than these people who completely reject the reality of Afghanistan and ask the international community to bring them back and parachute them into power. And that shouldn't be how we move forward. The role of men, what grinds my gears is the fact that the Taliban at least have the excuse of not being exposed to the world, or this is how they have been indoctrinated, this is how they... But then you see internationals here, Islamists, global Islamists, who celebrate the Taliban, right? They came to Kabul, and instead of sitting with the Taliban and saying, why have you closed schools, how is this Islamic? They sit down and they're like, Alhamdulillah, it's great that the Emirate is here, right? You see Haqju going and tweeting about how women should not be educated in Islam, right? These are the problematic thinkers who have very large audiences. It's these international Islamists who end up feeding the thinking of the Taliban and making them feel like they're in the right. So that's one way where the men have failed. But I also don't want to go to the extreme, because very often within the protests that happened in Afghanistan, the question is raised by some really good friends of mine, is like, where are the men in the protests, right? But you have to understand, if the men are there in the protest, both the men and the women will end up being treated much worse than they are when the women are just out there, right? So you have to realize that there are limitations of what can and cannot be done. I hope that addresses the situation. On the idea that you have to have more Islamic organizations being involved, and honestly, it is a failure on their part, because what they don't realize, I've said this to the Taliban, I'm like, you say you represent Islam and Islamic governance, that puts a very huge responsibility on you to be upright and then do a good job. Don't just be a bad example, you know? We have had enough of those. And ultimately, it's up to the OICs and the other Islamic governments, but again, like the mess in the rest of the world, the Islamic world is so non-monolithic, so many diverse thinkings, that it is in no one's interest to actually sit down and try to close this problem. On the ethnicity thing, right? the underlying assumption there is that Afghanistan has been a democracy for hundreds of years. It has not, right? These were monarchies run by people who belonged to specific ethnicities, right? Even if that ethnicity came from a majority ethnicity, these rulers, ultimately, I don't care. If you ask me as an educated Afghan, I don't care if a Babri gets elected tomorrow in Afghanistan and rules the country. I will happily give my social contract to them, right? So it's not about an ethnic domination, but the Taliban need to be mindful of this because the ethnicity card has been politicized in the past 20 years. You had the Muhaqqiqs and the Khalilis, and you had the Tajik leaders, you had the Pashtun leaders who were all using the ethnicity card and going to internationals and saying, I represent this community, and sort of splitting the nation apart. So it wasn't a nation building project. It ended up leaving us with so many more problems than we originally had.
Would Graham like to come in on any of this?
Yeah, I mean, just briefly on the role of the diaspora. So now, when I'm working on this stuff and getting together for drinks with friends from the International Crisis Group, you know, I see a lot of commonalities when I sit down and compare notes with friends who work on Ethiopia or Venezuela or Iran or Cuba. You know, there are these powerful diaspora lobbies that try to keep certain regimes on the outside of the international order. Often it's involving, you know, lobbyists in Washington, D.C. and voting constituencies. You know, people get involved in politics in places like the UK and push hard to make sure that, you know, the pressure is kept up on places like Afghanistan. I personally find it quite distasteful because I think that the burdens of that isolation fall most heavily on the most vulnerable Afghans. I mean, it's not the Taliban who are sitting outside of bakeries begging for a handout of naan, you know. It's often women and girls are the most vulnerable in the society. You know, when you go into a feeding center, 90% of the fatalities is little girls because little girls eat last in their families. And so, you know, when people are literally starving to death, I think it's quite cruel to be, you know, forcing deeper economic isolation on a country like this. On the flip side, though, you know, I would say you're there in the city of London, which is full of blue plaques commemorating famous political exiles, right? I mean, you can walk around your city there and see, you know, Karl Marx or Nehru or, you know, Gandhi or any of these people who were outside of their countries and went on to have important positive effects on the politics inside. And so I do think the diaspora can have a role to play, and I hope that someday we see a blue plaque with Obaidullah Bahir's name on it. Let's see.
Well, I'm sorry to say, but you know that will require him to die. And I hope that you do have a long life. So
fingers crossed.
To say yes. We are actually right out of time, so I really want to thank Obaidullah, and I want to thank Graham, and I want to thank Nilanjan, and I want to thank Sudhir for making all the arrangements for today's event. We will have another, you know, next Wednesday, we have Marvish Ahmed from the LSE. She's talking about disappearances in Balochistan. So there will be further notice on that. Please again, keep an eye out for that notice, and I think we'll have a better room than this one for next week. But thanks once again for all your questions and your engagement, and there's a lot for us to think about. See you later.